My coworker approached me at my wife's funeral and whispered, "She was leaving you for me that night." The casket was white with silver handles. I remember that detail because I was staring at it when Garrett Holloway leaned close to my ear during the receiving line and spoke the words that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. My wife had been dead for 6 days. Her body was recovered from the wreckage of her Camry on a rain-soaked highway at 11:43 p.m. I was still wearing the same black suit I bought for my father's funeral 3 years earlier because I couldn't imagine shopping for something new. The church was filled with flowers that made my head throb and people who kept touching my shoulder and saying she was in a better place. Then Garrett stepped forward with his hand extended like he was at a business conference instead of standing in front of my dead wife's body. He gripped my hand firmly and pulled me close. His breath smelled like mint and something sharper underneath. His lips barely moved when he spoke those 11 words. Then he stepped back, nodded solemnly, and walked toward the exit without looking back. I stood frozen in place while the next mourner approached. My mother was asking if I needed water. My brother was guiding me toward a chair. The room tilted sideways, and someone caught my elbow before I hit the floor. I'd been married to Meredith for 9 years when she died. We met at a friend's birthday party in 2014, when I was 28 and she was 26. She was wearing a green dress and laughing at something the host said, and I remember thinking she had the kind of laugh that made you want to be funnier just so you could hear it again. We talked for 3 hours that night about everything from our favorite terrible movies to our complicated relationships with our fathers. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company. I was a senior analyst at a financial consulting firm called Whitmore Partners. Our lives fit together easily like two puzzle pieces that had been waiting to connect. We got engaged after 18 months, married 6 months later, bought a house in the suburbs with a backyard big enough for the kids we planned to have. We talked about children constantly during the first few years, but something always came up. Her promotion, my travel schedule. The timing never felt right. Then the conversations became less frequent, and eventually we stopped having them altogether. I told myself we were just busy building our careers and our future. I told myself the distance I sometimes felt between us was normal for couples who had been together almost a decade. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies. Garrett Holloway had worked at Whitmore Partners for 3 years before Meredith died. He was a portfolio manager on the investment side while I handled analysis and strategy. We weren't friends, but we were friendly enough. He was the kind of guy who remembered everyone's birthday and organized the office fantasy football league. Tall, athletic build, prematurely gray at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. He was divorced with 2 kids he talked about constantly, showing pictures on his phone to anyone who would look. I thought he was harmless. I thought he was just another coworker making small talk in the break room while the coffee machine hummed. After the funeral, I replayed every interaction I could remember. The time he asked me how Meredith was doing with genuine interest. The office party where he spent 20 minutes talking to her while I was stuck in a conversation with the CEO. The way he always seemed to know details about our vacation plans or home renovation projects that I didn't remember sharing. Red flags that looked like nothing until they looked like everything. The first week after the funeral exists in my memory as a blur of casseroles and sympathy cards and phone calls I couldn't bring myself to answer. My mother stayed with me for the first few days until I convinced her I needed time alone. My brother Owen checked in every morning and evening with texts I responded to with single words. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching things Meredith had touched, sitting in chairs she sat in, sleeping on her side of the bed because it still smelled like her shampoo. I tried not to think about what Garrett said. I told myself he was lying, trying to hurt me for some reason I couldn't understand. Maybe he was mentally ill. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he misremembered something innocent and twisted it into something cruel. But the words kept echoing in my skull at 3 a.m., when I couldn't sleep and the house was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. She was leaving you for me that night. I started going through Meredith's things like a detective searching for evidence I desperately hoped I wouldn't find. Her phone was destroyed in the accident, but her laptop was sitting on her desk in the spare bedroom she used as a home office. I knew her password because we shared everything, or so I thought. The email account she used for work showed nothing unusual. The personal account she'd had since college was similarly mundane. Newsletters, order confirmations, messages from friends about brunch plans. I was about to close the laptop and feel foolish for even looking when I noticed the browser had multiple profiles saved. One was labeled with her name, the other was labeled with a single initial, M. My fingers hovered over the trackpad. Clicking that profile felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But I was already drowning, and I needed to know if there was a bottom to this ocean. The M profile opened to a different email account I had never seen before. The inbox contained 847 messages, all from the same sender. The display name said simply G, but the email address contained Garrett Holloway's full name. I read the first message at the top of the list, sent the morning of the day Meredith died. It said, "Tonight. Finally. I can't wait to start our real life together. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely scroll down to read more. The affair had been going on for 2 years and 3 months. I know this because Garrett documented everything with the obsessive detail of someone building a case file for their own happiness. The earliest email was dated January 15th, 2 years before Meredith's death. It started professionally enough, a message about a project they were supposedly collaborating on. But within 3 weeks, the tone shifted. Pet names appeared. Plans for lunch became plans for afternoons at a hotel near the office. I spent 6 hours reading through their correspondence, watching my marriage disintegrate in reverse chronological order. They talked about me constantly. Garrett called me oblivious and comfortable and too focused on work to notice what was happening right in front of me. Meredith called me distant and said she hadn't felt truly seen in years. They discussed timing, strategy, the best way to break the news. 6 months before she died, they started planning the logistics of her leaving. She would move into his apartment first, then they would find a place together. They agreed to wait until after my company's annual review cycle so my professional life wouldn't overlap with my personal devastation. How considerate of them. The night Meredith died, she told me she was visiting her college friend Simone, who was going through a difficult divorce. She would be home late, she said, maybe around midnight. Don't wait up. She kissed my cheek on her way out the door. I made myself dinner and watched a documentary about climate change and went to bed at 10:30 without a second thought. The police officer who showed up at 1:15 a.m. said she lost control on a curved section of highway during heavy rain. No other vehicles involved. She wasn't wearing her seatbelt, which was strange because Meredith always wore her seatbelt. The officer said she was pronounced dead at the scene. I remember asking him to repeat himself 3 times because the words didn't make sense. Now I knew the truth. She wasn't visiting Simone. She was leaving me. The emails confirmed they had planned to meet that night at Garrett's apartment. She was going to pack a bag and drive straight there after telling me she would be late. Something changed her route. Or maybe nothing changed, and she was simply driving toward her new life when the road curved and the rain fell and the universe decided to intervene. I couldn't decide if that made it better or worse. I called in sick to work for 2 weeks. My supervisor, Lorraine Kimball, sent flowers and a card signed by the entire department. I threw the card away when I noticed Garrett's name among the signatures. His handwriting was neat and small. So sorry for your loss. Thinking of you. The audacity of those words made me want to put my fist through the wall. Instead, I kept digging. Meredith's bank statements showed cash withdrawals I never noticed. Small amounts at first, $50 or $100 at a time. Then larger. In the 6 months before she died, she had withdrawn over $12,000 in cash that I couldn't account for. We had separate accounts for personal spending, but a joint account for household expenses. She had been skimming from the joint account too. I found transfers to her personal account that didn't match any expenses I could identify. My wife had been systematically preparing to leave me for 2 years, siphoning money and building an escape fund and lying to my face every single day. The grief I felt in the first week after her death transformed into something harder and colder. I still missed her. I still woke up reaching for her side of the bed. But now the missing was mixed with rage and betrayal and a humiliation so profound I could barely look at myself in the mirror. I went back to work on a Monday 3 weeks after the funeral. The office felt different, like returning to a house you lived in as a child to find all the furniture rearranged. People treated me with exaggerated gentleness. They spoke softly and avoided eye contact and asked if I needed anything in voices reserved for the terminally ill. Garrett was nowhere to be seen. I learned from a coworker that he had taken personal leave starting the day after the funeral. Convenient timing. I sat at my desk pretending to work while my mind churned through everything I had learned. The emails, the money, the lies. I needed answers that the evidence couldn't provide. I needed to understand how this happened, how I missed it, how the woman I loved could look me in the eyes and lie for 2 years without flinching. I needed to know what Garrett meant when he said those words at the funeral. Was it a confession? A taunt? A twisted attempt at closure? The only way to find out was to confront him directly, but I wasn't ready for that yet. I was still too raw, too angry, too likely to do something I would regret. So I did what any rational person would do in my situation. I hired a private investigator. Denise Kearney had been a PI for 15 years after a decade as a detective with the state police. I found her through a referral from my brother Owen, who knew someone who needed discreet investigation services during a messy custody battle. Denise was in her early 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. Her office was in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Nothing about her screamed private investigator, which I assumed was the point. I sat across from her desk and laid out everything I knew while she took notes on a yellow legal pad. The affair, the emails, the financial discrepancies, Garrett's whispered confession at the funeral. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with an expression that managed to be both sympathetic and professional. She said she had seen situations like this before, more often than people realized. Spouses living double lives, planning exits that got interrupted by tragedy. She could dig deeper into Garrett's background, find out if there were other women, other patterns, other secrets. She could also look into the accident itself if I wanted, though she cautioned me about going down that road. Sometimes knowing everything makes the pain worse instead of better, she said. I told her I needed to know everything. She nodded and quoted me a retainer fee of $3,000. I wrote the check without hesitating. 2 weeks later, Denise called me into her office with a preliminary report. Garrett Holloway had a history I never suspected. His divorce 3 years earlier wasn't the amicable separation he described in office small talk. His ex-wife Natalie had filed for divorce, citing infidelity. According to court records Denise obtained, Garrett had affairs with at least 2 other women during their marriage. One was a coworker at his previous company, the other was a neighbor in their subdivision. Natalie received full custody of their children and a substantial settlement because Garrett didn't contest anything. He wanted out quickly and quietly with minimal damage to his professional reputation. The pattern was clear. Garrett targeted women in his immediate orbit, cultivated relationships over time, and eventually convinced them to blow up their lives for him. My wife wasn't special to him. She was a type, someone vulnerable enough to be charmed and naive enough to believe his promises. Denise showed me printouts of social media posts from women who had worked with Garrett at his previous job. Vague references to toxic co-workers and learning to trust your instincts. One woman posted about surviving a manipulative relationship without naming names. The digital breadcrumbs painted a picture of a man who left damage wherever he went. The accident report was harder to obtain, but Denise had contacts in the highway patrol who owed her favors. The investigating officer was named Ramon Vega, a 22-year veteran of the department. His report stated that Meredith's vehicle left the roadway at approximately 11:38 p.m. during a period of heavy rainfall. Skid marks indicated she attempted to brake before the vehicle struck a guardrail and rolled twice. She was ejected through the driver's side window because her seatbelt was not fastened. Toxicology came back clean for alcohol and drugs. Speed at the time of the accident was estimated at 73 miles per hour in a 55 zone. The official conclusion was driver error caused by weather conditions and excessive speed. Nothing suspicious. Nothing to investigate further. But Denise pointed out several details that bothered her. The location of the accident was 30 miles from Garrett's apartment, in the opposite direction from Simone's house. If Meredith was heading to meet Garrett that night, she was going the wrong way. There was also the seatbelt issue. Meredith was obsessive about seatbelts. I couldn't remember a single time in 9 years when she hadn't buckled up immediately upon getting in any vehicle. The investigating officer noted it as unusual, but not determinative. Denise thought it was worth a closer look. I started having trouble sleeping around this time. Not just the normal insomnia of grief, but something darker and more persistent. I would lie awake for hours, replaying conversations with Meredith, searching for clues I missed. I would fall asleep around 4 in the morning and wake up at 6 with my heart racing from dreams I couldn't remember. My appetite disappeared. I lost 12 pounds in a month without trying. My brother Owen noticed and started showing up at my house with food he demanded I eat while he watched. He didn't know about the affair or the investigation. I told him I was struggling with grief, which was technically true even if it wasn't the whole truth. I didn't know how to explain that my dead wife had been planning to leave me, that my coworker had been sleeping with her for 2 years, that everything I believed about my marriage was a carefully constructed lie. The shame was almost worse than the betrayal. How could I not have known? What kind of idiot misses something so enormous happening in his own home? The rational part of my brain understood that affairs were specifically designed to be hidden, that skilled liars could deceive anyone. But the irrational part whispered that I must have been willfully blind, that I chose not to see because seeing would have required action. Garrett returned to the office on a Wednesday 5 weeks after the funeral. I watched him walk through the lobby from my desk on the 3rd floor, his gait confident and unhurried. He stopped to shake hands with a junior analyst and laughed at something the receptionist said. The performance was flawless. No one watching would guess this man had been sleeping with a coworker's wife for 2 years, then whispered a cruel revelation at her funeral. I felt my jaw clench so tight my teeth ached. The urge to confront him right there in the open plan office was almost overwhelming. I wanted to stand up and shout the truth to everyone within earshot, to rip away the mask he wore and show them the monster underneath. But Denise had warned me against premature confrontation. We needed more evidence. We needed to understand why Meredith was driving in the wrong direction that night. We needed to know if Garrett was involved in something darker than adultery. So I stayed in my chair and pretended to review spreadsheets while my heart hammered against my ribs. Garrett glanced in my direction once and nodded with an expression of practiced sympathy. I nodded back. The mask I was wearing felt just as suffocating as his. Denise discovered the second phone a week later. She had been monitoring Garrett's public social media and noticed inconsistencies in his location data. Photos posted from his apartment on days his car was spotted elsewhere. Check-ins at restaurants when credit card records showed purchases in different cities. The discrepancies suggested he was using multiple devices to create false alibis or mislead anyone tracking his movements. Her contact at the phone company confirmed that Garrett had 2 active lines under his name. The primary number was the one listed in his work profile. The secondary number was registered to a virtual carrier and paid for with prepaid credit cards purchased at gas stations. Classic burner phone behavior. Whatever Garrett was hiding, he was taking significant precautions to keep it hidden. Denise said this elevated her concern level considerably. People having affairs used secret phones, sure, but the level of operational security Garrett maintained suggested he was protecting something bigger than infidelity. She recommended I contact a lawyer to discuss my options before we went any further. I found Claire Ashworth through a legal referral service that connected people with attorneys specializing in complex domestic situations. She had been practicing family law for 18 years with a focus on high-asset divorces and estate disputes. Her office was in a downtown high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Everything about her projected competence and control, from her tailored blazer to her precisely organized desk. I explained my situation in clinical detail: wife deceased, evidence of long-term affair, financial irregularities, suspicious circumstances surrounding the accident. Claire listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a tablet. When I finished, she asked several clarifying questions about the timeline and documentation. Then she leaned back in her chair and gave me her professional assessment. From a legal standpoint, I had several options. I could pursue civil action against Garrett for alienation of affection in states that recognized such claims, though we weren't in one of those states. I could potentially pursue him for intentional infliction of emotional distress based on his funeral confession. If evidence emerged suggesting involvement in Meredith's death, that would be a criminal matter requiring immediate contact with law enforcement. The financial issues were complicated by Meredith's death. Any money she took from joint accounts was technically half hers. Recovery would be difficult, and likely not worth the legal costs. Claire recommended I continue working with Denise to gather evidence while she researched potential claims. She also suggested I document every interaction with Garrett going forward. If he approached me again, or made any statements that could be construed as threatening or harassing, that would strengthen any civil case. I asked her what she thought I should do personally, not legally. She paused for a moment before answering. She said in her experience, people in my situation needed closure more than compensation. The money wouldn't bring Meredith back or undo the betrayal, but understanding what happened, exposing the truth, holding someone accountable, that could provide a foundation for moving forward. She warned me that the process would be painful and potentially humiliating. Details might emerge that I would rather not know. Was I prepared for that? I told her I had already read 2 years of love letters between my wife and the man who destroyed my marriage. I was prepared for anything. She nodded and said she would be in touch once she finished her research. I left her office feeling something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Purpose. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Meredith's best friend Paige called me one evening, 3 months after the funeral, asking if we could meet for coffee. We had seen each other at the service but hadn't spoken since. She said there was something she needed to tell me, something she should have told me a long time ago. We met at a cafe near her apartment the following Saturday. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her coffee cup and avoiding eye contact. After several minutes of small talk, she took a deep breath and said she knew about Garrett. She had known for over a year. Meredith told her everything because she needed someone to confide in, and Paige was her oldest friend. Paige said she urged Meredith to end the affair multiple times. She told her she was making a terrible mistake, that Garrett was manipulating her, that she was throwing away a good marriage for fantasy. But Meredith was convinced she had found her soulmate, that their connection was special, that I would be happier in the long run without her. The delusion was staggering. Paige started crying as she spoke, apologizing over and over for not telling me sooner. She said she was trapped between loyalty to her friend and doing the right thing. She chose wrong and would regret it forever. I sat in silence while Paige composed herself. Part of me wanted to scream at her for keeping the secret, for letting me live a lie while she watched. But a larger part understood her impossible position. She wasn't the villain here. She was collateral damage just like me. I asked her what she knew about the night Meredith died. Paige's expression changed, shifting from guilt to something closer to fear. She said Meredith called her around 8:30 that evening, upset about something. She wouldn't give details, but she kept saying she had made a terrible mistake and didn't know what to do. Paige assumed she meant the affair and told her to go home and talk to me, to finally tell the truth. Meredith said she couldn't, that it was too late, that something had happened that changed everything. Then she hung up and didn't answer when Paige tried calling back. That phone call was 3 hours before the accident. 3 hours before Meredith drove in the wrong direction at 73 miles per hour without her seatbelt fastened. Something happened that night that Paige didn't know about. Something terrible enough to make Meredith panic. Something that might explain why she was heading away from Garrett instead of toward him. I thanked Paige for telling me the truth and asked if she would be willing to give a statement to my investigator. She agreed immediately, eager for any chance at redemption. Denise interviewed Paige the following week and added her statement to the growing file. The evidence was pointing toward a narrative I hadn't considered before. What if Meredith wasn't leaving me that night? What if she was running from Garrett? The phone records Denise obtained showed multiple calls between Garrett and Meredith's number in the hours before the accident. The calls grew longer and more frequent as the evening progressed. The final call lasted 11 minutes and ended at 11:27 p.m., 11 minutes before the accident occurred. I imagined Meredith driving through the rain with her phone pressed to her ear, arguing with Garrett about something, distracted enough to speed, upset enough to forget her seatbelt, desperate enough to drive in the opposite direction from where he expected her to be. The pieces were assembling into a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Denise said we needed more evidence before drawing conclusions, but she agreed the circumstances warranted deeper investigation. She was going to contact Officer Vega and ask if he would be willing to discuss the case off the record. Sometimes investigators missed things during initial examinations. Sometimes fresh eyes found what tired ones overlooked. Officer Ramon Vega agreed to meet with Denise at a diner near his precinct. She recorded the conversation with his permission and played it for me later that day. His voice was gravelly and tired, the voice of someone who had seen too much tragedy to be surprised by anything. He remembered the case clearly because the circumstances bothered him at the time. The seatbelt issue was the main thing. He ran the victim's driving history and found no accidents, no citations, no evidence of reckless behavior. Her vehicle was well maintained with no mechanical issues. The weather was bad, but not unprecedented. Something about the scene didn't add up, but he couldn't articulate what. His supervisor pushed him to close the case quickly. Single vehicle accidents were straightforward. No one to sue, no investigation required. Just another tragedy on a rainy night. Vega complied because he had 30 other cases demanding attention, but he kept a personal copy of the file just in case. When Denise told him about the affair and the financial irregularities and the phone records, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said there was one detail he never included in the official report because it seemed irrelevant at the time. When he examined the interior of the vehicle, he found a packed suitcase in the trunk. It contained women's clothing, toiletries, and approximately $8,000 in cash. He logged it as personal property and returned it to me along with everything else from the vehicle. I never noticed because I never opened the suitcase. It was still sitting in my garage where I put it 3 months ago. I drove home from Denise's office at 20 miles over the speed limit. The suitcase was exactly where I left it, covered in dust in the corner of the garage near the lawn equipment. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table, my hands trembling as I unzipped it. The cash was bundled in rubber bands, mostly 20s and 50s. The clothes were folded neatly with toiletries in a clear plastic bag on top. At the bottom of the suitcase, underneath a sweater Meredith wore on our anniversary 2 years ago, I found an envelope with my name written in her handwriting. Inside was a letter dated the day she died. My heart stopped. My vision blurred. I sat down before my legs gave out and forced myself to read the words my wife left behind. The letter began with an apology. She was sorry for everything she was about to tell me and everything she had already done. She said she had been having an affair for 2 years with a man from my office. She didn't name him, but she didn't need to. She said she thought she loved him, thought he was offering her a life full of passion and excitement that our marriage had lost somewhere along the way. She was wrong. She realized it too late. The man she thought loved her was manipulating her for money and status, and whatever sick satisfaction he derived from destroying other people's lives. She discovered his true nature 3 weeks before she died, when she found evidence he was seeing another woman at the same time. When she confronted him, he laughed and told her she was naive. He said she was never going to leave me because she was too scared, and he was right about that part at least. But the discovery woke her up. She saw the affair for what it was, a pathetic escape from a marriage she hadn't tried hard enough to fix. She decided to end it and come clean to me. She was going to tell me everything that night and beg for forgiveness. The suitcase was packed for a different reason than I assumed. She was leaving all right, but she was leaving Garrett, not me. The letter continued with details that made my chest ache. She described how Garrett reacted when she told him it was over. He refused to accept her decision. He called her constantly, showed up at places she frequented, sent threatening emails to her secret account. He said if she went back to me, he would destroy both our lives. He had copies of every message they ever exchanged. He had photographs. He had financial records showing the money she skimmed. He would send everything to my boss, my family, my friends. He would ruin her career and mine. She would lose everything and have nothing to show for it. Meredith wrote that she didn't care about her own reputation, but she couldn't stand the thought of hurting me that way. So she made a plan. She would take the evidence of his harassment to HR and file a complaint. She would consult a lawyer about a restraining order. She would document everything and build a case against him before coming to me with the truth. The suitcase was an insurance policy. If Garrett made good on his threats before she was ready, she would have money and clothes to survive while she figured out next steps. She never got the chance to execute the plan. The final paragraph was the hardest to read. She wrote that she loved me more than she ever managed to show. She was sorry for taking our marriage for granted, for seeking excitement outside instead of working to find it within. She was sorry for every lie, every excuse, every moment of distance that pushed us apart. If I was reading this letter, something had gone wrong with her plan. She hoped I could forgive her someday. She hoped I could remember the good years before the bad ones. She hoped I could find someone who would love me the way I deserved to be loved. She signed it with her name and a small heart, the same way she signed birthday cards and anniversary notes for 9 years. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in my hands and cried harder than I had since the night she died. Everything I thought I knew was wrong again. My wife wasn't leaving me. She was trying to come back. I brought the letter and the suitcase to Denise the next morning. She read it 3 times, her expression growing darker with each pass. "This changes everything," she said. "If Meredith was being harassed and threatened by Garrett in the weeks before her death, and if she died under suspicious circumstances while trying to escape him, we might be looking at something more than infidelity." She contacted Officer Vega immediately and shared the new evidence. He agreed to reopen an informal investigation, though he cautioned that proving anything beyond reasonable doubt would be extremely difficult. The case was 3 months old. Physical evidence was degraded or gone. Witnesses might not remember details clearly, but he would do what he could. Claire Ashworth called me that afternoon with equally urgent news. She had been researching Garrett's background and found something disturbing. He had been named in a civil suit 5 years earlier by a woman claiming emotional distress and harassment. The case was settled out of court with a non-disclosure agreement. The details were sealed, but the existence of the suit established a pattern. Garrett had done this before. The next 2 weeks were a blur of interviews and document reviews and strategy sessions. Denise dug into Garrett's finances and found irregularities suggesting he was spending far beyond his apparent income. She located the woman from the previous lawsuit through court records and convinced her to speak off the record. Her story was chillingly similar to Meredith's. Garrett pursued her aggressively, convinced her to leave her husband, then turned threatening when she tried to end things. She paid him $30,000 to go away and signed the NDA because she was terrified of what he might do otherwise. She believed he was capable of violence, but had no proof. Officer Vega re-examined the accident scene photos and noticed something he missed before. There were 2 sets of tire tracks on the road leading up to the crash site. One set matched Meredith's Camry. The other set was consistent with a larger vehicle, possibly an SUV or truck. It could be nothing. Other cars use that road all the time, but it could also mean someone was following Meredith that night. Garrett drove a black Ford Explorer. I went to work every day during this period and pretended everything was normal. Garrett and I passed each other in hallways and nodded politely. We sat in the same meetings and contributed to the same projects. The performance required every ounce of self-control I possessed. Knowing what I knew, suspecting what I suspected, and having to act like a grieving widower slowly returning to routine was excruciating. Claire advised me to maintain the facade until we had enough evidence to act. Premature confrontation could spook Garrett into destroying evidence or fleeing. We needed him confident and careless. So I smiled and nodded and waited. The hardest moment came during an all-hands meeting when Garrett gave a presentation on quarterly results. He stood at the front of the room, charming and composed, cracking jokes that made everyone laugh. He mentioned my wife's passing briefly, calling it a tragedy that reminded us all to cherish our loved ones. My fingernails dug into my palms so hard they drew blood. I excused myself to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face until the urge to vomit passed. 2 more weeks, Denise said. 2 more weeks, and we would have everything we needed. The evidence came together faster than expected. Denise obtained Garrett's phone records through a contact who owed her multiple favors. The burner phone showed dozens of calls to Meredith's number in the month before her death, far more than their regular communication pattern. On the night she died, the burner phone pinged cell towers along the same route Meredith drove, tracking her path until 2 minutes before the accident. Then the phone went dark. Garrett claimed to be home alone that night when Denise interviewed him under the guise of insurance paperwork related to my wife's death. He said he was watching television and went to bed early. His regular phone showed activity consistent with that story, but the burner phone told a different tale. Officer Vega ran the tire track analysis and confirmed the second set belonged to a vehicle in Garrett's weight class. Combined with the phone records and the letter and the pattern of harassment, we had circumstantial evidence suggesting Garrett followed Meredith that night. We couldn't prove he caused the accident. We couldn't prove intent, but we could prove he lied about his whereabouts and was tracking her movements in the hours before she died. Claire prepared a civil complaint alleging wrongful death, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Denise compiled the evidence into a comprehensive report with supporting documentation. Officer Vega wrote a supplemental statement recommending the district attorney review the case for potential criminal charges. We had everything we needed except the moment of confrontation. I wanted to be there when Garrett learned his world was about to collapse. I needed to see his face when the mask finally cracked. Claire advised against it, citing potential legal complications, but I was done taking cautious advice. This man destroyed my marriage, tormented my wife, possibly contributed to her death, and then whispered cruel words at her funeral while I stood next to her casket. I had earned the right to watch him fall. We agreed to serve the civil complaint at the office where everyone could witness his humiliation. The date was set for Friday at 2 p.m. The morning of the confrontation, I woke up at 4:30 and couldn't go back to sleep. I lay in bed watching the ceiling gradually lighten as dawn approached. I thought about Meredith and the life we built and the lies that corroded it from within. I thought about the letter she wrote and the plan she never got to execute. I thought about all the ways I failed to notice what was happening right in front of me. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there, but it had transformed into something productive. I couldn't change the past, but I could ensure the man responsible for so much pain faced consequences. I showered and dressed in my best suit, the one I saved for important client meetings. I ate breakfast for the first time in weeks because I needed the energy. Then I drove to the office with a cold clarity I hadn't felt in months. At 1:45 p.m., I was sitting at my desk pretending to review a financial model when the process server walked through the lobby. He was a heavy-set man in a plain gray suit carrying a manila envelope. I watched him approach the receptionist and ask for Garrett Holloway. She paged Garrett over the intercom, her voice echoing through the open floor plan. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Something about the man's presence signaled that this wasn't a normal delivery. Garrett emerged from his office on the opposite side of the floor, his expression curious, but unworried. He smiled at the process server and asked how he could help. The server handed him the envelope and said he was being served with a civil complaint filed in county court. Then he turned and walked out without another word. Garrett stood in the middle of the office holding the envelope like it might explode. His eyes scanned the document visible through the opening. I watched his face drain of color as he read the allegations. Wrongful death, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, names of witnesses, descriptions of evidence. Every secret he thought was buried laid bare in legal language. The silence in the office was absolute. Everyone was staring at Garrett, waiting to see what he would do next. He looked up from the document, and his eyes found mine across the room. The mask slipped completely in that moment. I saw rage and fear and desperation in his expression, the face of a predator suddenly realizing he was the prey. He took 3 steps toward me before security arrived. 2 guards, alerted by Claire's advance warning, intercepted him and asked him to come with them. He resisted briefly, shouting that this was ridiculous, that I was crazy, that he would sue me for defamation. The guards guided him firmly toward the elevator, while the entire office watched in stunned silence. Lorraine Kimball emerged from her office and asked what was happening. I handed her a copy of the complaint and a summary of the evidence Denise had compiled. Her face went through several expressions as she read. Shock, disgust, anger. She said she would need to discuss this with legal and HR immediately. By the end of the day, Garrett Holloway was terminated for cause. His belongings were boxed up and shipped to his apartment. His access credentials were revoked. His name was removed from the company directory. The criminal investigation took longer. The district attorney reviewed Officer Vega's supplemental report and agreed the circumstances warranted further examination. They subpoenaed Garrett's phone records, financial documents, and electronic communications. They interviewed the woman from the previous lawsuit after Claire negotiated a release from her NDA. They built a case methodically and carefully, aware that conviction would be difficult without direct evidence of causation. 6 months after the civil complaint was filed, Garrett Holloway was charged with stalking, harassment, and reckless endangerment. The prosecutor couldn't prove he caused the accident, but they could prove he tracked Meredith's location without her consent and followed her that night while ignoring her explicit demands to leave her alone. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 8 years if convicted on all counts. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I sat in the gallery every day, watching as witnesses testified to Garrett's pattern of predatory behavior. Natalie, his ex-wife, described years of manipulation and infidelity. The woman from the previous lawsuit detailed harassment that left her afraid to leave her house for months. Paige recounted Meredith's phone call on the night she died, her voice breaking as she described the fear in her friend's words. Officer Vega presented the forensic evidence: cell tower pings, tire track analysis, the letter Meredith left behind. Claire testified as an expert on the legal implications of Garrett's behavior. The defense tried to paint me as a grieving widower seeking someone to blame for his wife's death. They suggested Meredith was the aggressor, that she pursued Garrett, that he was just as much a victim of her manipulation as anyone else. The jury didn't buy it. They returned a guilty verdict on all counts after less than 4 hours of deliberation. The sentencing hearing was my chance to speak. I stood at the podium facing the judge and the crowded courtroom and Garrett Holloway sitting in his orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remembered. I talked about the 9 years I spent with Meredith and the 2 years Garrett stole from us through lies and manipulation. I talked about the letter she left behind and the plan she never got to execute. I talked about standing at her funeral while the man who tormented her whispered cruelty in my ear. I talked about the sleepless nights and the destroyed trust and the grief that transformed into something harder because of what he did. I asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence so that Garrett could never do this to another family. The judge listened carefully and considered the victim impact statements from everyone affected. Then she sentenced Garrett Holloway to 7 years in state prison with no possibility of early parole. He would serve every single day. It's been 18 months since the sentencing. I sold the house that Meredith and I shared and moved to a different city where no one knows my story. I see a therapist named Dr. Nathaniel Reeves every other week to work through the grief and anger and guilt that still surface unexpectedly. He helped me understand that Meredith's choices were her own, influenced by a skilled manipulator but ultimately hers. He helped me forgive her for the lies while honoring the love that was real underneath them. He helped me accept that closure doesn't mean forgetting. The civil settlement from Garrett's remaining assets went to a nonprofit that supports victims of stalking and harassment. I didn't want his money. I wanted his accountability, and I got it. Paige and I have dinner sometimes. We don't talk about Meredith often, but when we do, we try to remember the person she was before everything went wrong. The woman who laughed at terrible movies and dreamed about having children and tried, in the end, to make things right. I keep Meredith's letter in a safe deposit box because I can't bear to look at it often, but I can't throw it away either. Some days I read it and feel nothing but sorrow for what we lost. Other days I feel anger that she put us in that position in the first place. Most days I feel something in between, a complicated mix of love and grief and acceptance that doesn't have a name. She wasn't perfect. Neither was I. Our marriage had problems that neither of us was brave enough to address. But she didn't deserve what Garrett did to her. She didn't deserve to die on a rainy highway trying to escape a monster. She deserved the chance to come home and tell me the truth and see if we could rebuild something worth saving. Garrett took that chance away from both of us. Now he's spending 7 years in a cell thinking about what he did. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's something. Last week, I got a letter forwarded from my old address. The return label showed a prison in the southern part of the state. I knew who it was from before I opened it. Garrett wrote that he was sorry for everything, that he had time to reflect on his choices, that he wanted me to know he never intended for anyone to get hurt. The letter was 3 pages of self-justification and minimization and requests for forgiveness that made my jaw clench. I didn't respond. I burned it in my fireplace and watched the ashes drift up the chimney. Some people don't deserve forgiveness. Some people don't deserve closure. Some people deserve exactly what they get and nothing more. The last line Garrett wrote before signing his name was a question. He asked if I thought there was any chance I could find it in my heart to understand his perspective someday. The answer is no. The answer will always be no. My wife was leaving him that night, not me. She was trying to come back to our marriage when he chased her through the rain and watched her die. He can spend the rest of his life looking for understanding from someone else. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.